Live everywhere.
Daily Co's Radio on netrootsradio.com presents
David Walton. Kagro in the Morning Show. Now, here's David Waldman.
Hey, good morning, everybody. How you doing? It is, Friday, February 28th, 2020. Ordinarily the last day of February, but not this year because leap year. Tomorrow is the end of February. We won't be here. It's Saturday. It won't make a difference in the way we cover things, but just thought I'd make mention of it. It's a fun thing to do. I've got a young nephew who's actually a February 29th birthday, so this is his happy second birthday to you. And, well, not yet, tomorrow, but you won't be listening to this show either today or tomorrow. But the point is that a point was made, and that's really something. And in these times, so often more than you can hope for if you're, say, listening to world leaders or your president or whatever. Anyway, lots to catch up on. Of course, coronavirus continues to dominate much of the news, and much of the news is about how much of the news that you're getting from your political leadership in this country isn't actually useful or even true news. But, we're all coming to grips with these things. I see this morning, interesting tidbit, I guess. Chuck Todd, not at all shaken by the possibility of a 2% mortality rate. I mean, it is interesting. I guess it's a good thing for our communicators to be telling people, well, don't get too nervous or panicky about things. Coronavirus is not causing that severe an illness in most people presented with it. I guess the COVID-19 manifestation of the virus is, well, as they say, its mortality rate it's a high mortality rate, as commonly passed around viruses, I guess, go 2%, and you don't want to be part of that 2%. But there's something worth telling people. You can get it and be just fine. Eventually, you'll be sick for a while, and then you'll be not sick, and that's good news. But a 2% mortality rate, of course, well, there are a lot of people in the world, and if we all get it, and 2% of us die, that's an awful lot of dead people to be taken care of and replacing and worrying about and taking time off from work for, et cetera, et cetera. But I guess it's a good idea to remind people. Well, certainly you shouldn't fear that it's a death sentence of some kind. And if you get it, don't go home and jump off a building because you're going to die from coronavirus. It's not Ebola in that sense, true. But it is interesting to watch people saying things like, well, only 2%. Okay, what that means is it would be, I guess, fair to say, well, it is a 2% mortality rate, and that means you will, if you were to get it and you're an otherwise healthy adult, you're likely to come out of this thing okay. So don't panic and kill yourself. But it is worth noting that 2% of the population is an awful lot, and that carries with it a lot of warning, a lot of responsibility, a lot of things that we're going to have to prepare for and expect. Things we're expecting now, I guess. Shortages in supply of certain products, perhaps slowdown in some industries, etc. It has ripple effects, and we all have to be aware of them. But I was mostly taken with the idea that you could comfortably express things in terms of it only being only 2%, because, of course, it struck me that, well, there's a lot of things that are only 2%. We've been talking about a lot of them in the news lately anyway, but somehow that 2% is crazy. I just was sort of struck by that. 2% of the world population dying from this infection, it's only 2%. Now, there's a lot of people in the world. That's millions of people would be killed by this virus in the end. And those are the sorts of numbers that make us worry and panic and freak out about things. But 2%, that makes us feel comfortable about things. Well, anyway, don't worry about it. Anyway, I would say to Chuck Todd, for instance, if Elizabeth Warren were elected president and were able to enact her 2% wealth surtax, 98% of your money over $50 million will be just fine and come through it with flying colors. So don't worry. But that 2%, I guess, well, that's just too much for some people. It depends, Numbers are weird, and they affect different people in different ways. So, all right, let's see. What other fun things do we have to round up via the Twitter machine or what we've tucked away in pocket? There are an awful lot of different directions that we could probably go with this whole February 28th thing. I saw, speaking of coronavirus, let's investigate this piece here. This was sort of an interesting a policy direction on the coronavirus brought to my attention via Twitter this morning from, what is this? Stat News. I'm not even certain what I'm reading here. Is it all healthcare news? Maybe that's it. I guess like stat in the hospital emergency room loudspeaker sense. We have this piece from Wendy K. Mariner, who is, we're told at the bottom of the piece here, a lawyer and a professor of health law at Boston University School of Public Health and the Center for Health Law, Ethics, and Human Rights, which I guess tells us a little bit about where she's coming from in all of this, and what a nice center it is that they have, the Center for Health Law, Ethics, and Human Rights. Terrific. Wendy Mariner, JD, that's the law degree, tells us, or floats this idea. Well, if we're going to be quarantining people for coronavirus, she's got a suggestion for how to make that very onerous sounding necessity unnecessary. Quarantine for coronavirus, let's make that unnecessary. Yes, let's do that. Here's how, or at least one suggestion how it might be done. Do you trust the government, she begins, to protect you and your family from the novel coronavirus called COVID-19, which, as I understand it, is not what the novel coronavirus is called, but rather the disease that it causes, I guess, is COVID-19. That's what I thought I heard from Greg, but really, I shouldn't be worrying about that. Do you trust the government to do this, to protect you and your family from it? Not this one, probably. But maybe in general, the idea of a government protecting someone isn't that far-fetched. Anyway, it goes on to say, Centers for Disease Control and Prevention officials say more cases are inevitable. The president says, no, they're not. In the United States, although they can't predict how many and when they will appear. I'm going to say 11 at the sound of the tone. Bing. There you go. President Trump says the risk is low, and we're very, very ready for this. But what does it mean to be ready, let alone very, very ready? The emergence of a new infectious disease often prompts governments to consider quarantines. Officials in China recently turned to this drastic option, blocking most travel into and out of it should be blocking travel into and out of my kitchen, apparently. I'm dying of the virus right now. But they were blocking travel into and out of Wuhan, the center of the COVID-19 outbreak. As cases appear in other countries, they too are thinking about quarantine. Not here in the United States, where we're not thinking about anything. The term quarantine means restricting the movements of individuals who have been or might have been exposed to a contagious disease. Although it is often used interchangeably with isolation, the latter means confining individuals known to have a contagious infection, usually as part of medical treatment. Quarantine and isolation can be voluntary or involuntary. The CDC has broad authority, some say overbroad, to approve involuntary quarantines under final regulations governing domestic and foreign quarantine that were issued in January 2017. Before resorting to the draconian measure of involuntary quarantine, I think we should make it unnecessary. Two complementary efforts can make that happen. Providing credible information to the public, or rather, that it can trust. It's actually put this way. Providing credible information the public can trust, and that one's out. And making it possible to comply with disease avoidance recommendations without excessive personal or financial cost. That's the real key to this article. So far, public health recommendations focus on asking people to protect themselves by washing their hands and covering their coughs. while this is good advice, it puts the onus on the individual. Well, okay. Well, who's going to wash your hands and cover your coughs for you? That's the way it's going to be. Threats of involuntary quarantine often come next, which looks a lot like blaming the victim, punishing people for getting sick, or treating people like criminals, not patients. That makes the target of disease control efforts a person instead of a pathogen. That is one way of looking at it. And people don't like involuntary quarantine, of course, and they probably do feel that way. Although even voluntary quarantine, I guess, feels like blaming the victim, especially if you're someone who can't afford to miss work or will lose your job if you miss work. But okay. When individuals are viewed as potential threats to public health, they may feel unfairly attacked and stigmatized. And if people doubt what the government says, they may decline to follow even sensible recommendations. Or even if they do believe what the government says but can't afford, they think, to follow those recommendations, they may decline. Infection is not the only harm to the public during an outbreak. And that's the biggest thing I'm learning from every time we listen to Greg talk about pandemic preparedness. Infection is not the only harm to the public during an outbreak. During the 2014 to 2016 Ebola outbreak, hysteria, politicization, and some states' rejection of CDC recommendations created more harm than the disease itself. People were threatened by law enforcement and public officials. Children were bullied in schools. Individuals were not allowed to work or, in some circumstances, dismissed from their jobs. While the spread of misinformation, largely through the media, carries much of the blame, those who embraced, enforced, or advocated for overly strict quarantine measures certainly fanned the flames. To gain public trust, health officials must be honest and transparent about what is and is not known about a disease outbreak, provide useful recommendations for avoiding infection as well. Giving people credible information about what they can do is as important a first step in facing an infectious... Why is it that I find myself, I guess, with this writing style, inserting additional words here and screwing things up? Giving people credible information about what they can do is an important first step in facing an infectious disease outbreak. I guess I'm just not entirely in sync with the way she's telling her story here. And time to get our act together. Okay, let's see. Continuing on, asking people to protect themselves is necessary to help prevent the spread of infectious diseases like COVID-19, for which there is yet is no vaccine or cure. Man, not really in sync with this writing. But it isn't sufficient because not everyone can comply with recommendations like social distancing, such as not going to school or work and avoiding places where others congregate. Following such recommendations is almost impossible for day laborers who don't get paid if they don't go to work, for people with low-wage jobs, for people who don't have paid sick leave, and others. Watching lots of people tweeting this morning about being reminded of when they worked as, early in their careers before they moved on to other bigger, better things, working as, a college student or high school students as servers in restaurants, and not being able to take sick days when they were ill because they would be fired if they didn't show up for work, and working while they were sick and thinking, man, all those people I was probably shedding my virus to because I couldn't afford not to be there. And these poor people are just looking for a nice meal out, and they go home with my illness because the economic system is such that I can't afford to not risk their health. That does seem kind of crazy, doesn't it? All right. Well, of course, that's for many Americans, a few days of lost wages can mean not being able to pay the rent, buy food, or afford medications, which might become important in a situation like this. They may feel compelled to go to work even if they aren't feeling well because they need the money. We need to make it possible for such individuals, who make up a large chunk of Americans, to stay home. That means providing some sort of replacement income or job security, either through the private sector or the government. That is the bottom line, isn't it? Would that be expensive? Yes, but it is equally expensive, and it's very difficult to get people to do the math in their heads about what's equally expensive, but here she tries, It is equally expensive and maybe even more costly to put people in institutional quarantine settings because you still have to provide staff, food, water, medicine, and access to communications with friends and family. That is not cheap. Just look at our prison system. How interesting. This is very multidisciplinary in all of this. If we can give people the resources they need to stay home during a disease outbreak and avoid workplaces, schools, theaters, and other places where people gather. Theaters. That's very old-fashioned of you. I mean, it's true, but it's an interesting thought. There would be fewer opportunities for people to fear that they would contract the virus. It would reduce the strain on our hospitals and healthcare systems. Forget the fear, it's actually contracting the virus. And most importantly, it would recognize and reward the sacrifice that people voluntarily make to protect the community. How interesting is that? Right? Good thinking. People don't want to make other people sick. They will comply with credible recommendations and voluntarily stay home if it is possible for them to do so. This means preventive measures must include providing the resources that make it possible. During the SARS outbreak, which first emerged in November of 2002, the government in Singapore provided economic assistance to individuals and businesses affected by the quarantine. In Hong Kong, individuals received daily material and financial assistance. The CDC's 2017 regulations don't mention these legitimate concerns. They only allow the CDC director to authorize payment treating people, that's what it says, to authorize payment for treating people, I guess, treating people who are involuntarily confined in a quarantine facility. Fear of being quarantined itself can create resistance. If you're afraid you're going to get locked up somewhere, you may not want to admit you have an illness. Sure. You may not want to go to the doctor for fear of being reported. If you are told you can't leave your city, you might flee. That's what happened in China during the SARS outbreak. A rumor that the government was planning a large-scale involuntary quarantine caused nearly 250,000 people to leave Beijing, which is not that many out of Beijing, I guess. It's only 2% or whatever. And quarantines aren't without their costs. The Wuhan quarantine has had numerous unintended effects, some of them fatal. People were unable to reach sick elderly parents in the city, let alone take them elsewhere for treatment of chronic conditions like heart disease and cancer. The United Nations AIDS emergency recently announced that agency recently announced that 1/3 of people in China who are living with HIV were at risk of running out of their HIV medications because of lockdowns and travel restrictions. The quarantine has also severely slowed China's economy. As the CDC and other public health agencies know, quarantine by itself may delay the spread of an infectious disease, but it cannot prevent or end any disease outbreak. It has not succeeded in the past, and it is ill-suited to the realities of the contemporary world. A better way to fight infectious disease outbreaks is by creating a resilient population that is more likely to withstand potential epidemics. As my colleague Michael Ulrich and I wrote in the SMU Law Review in 2018, populations with good nutrition, high literacy rates, adequate income, and access to appropriate medical care, social services, and sources of reliable information are better prepared to understand the meaning of an outbreak and what to do in response. They are also less likely to suffer severe illness if the infection spreads to them. Even in a reasonably resilient population like the United States, limiting the spread of a novel pathogen depends on public trust in government recommendations. But trust goes both ways. Government must also trust people to follow reasonable recommendations, and it can do that if its recommendations are reasonable and credible, and people have the means to voluntarily comply with them. So, stops short of really explaining exactly how you would do such a thing, and I mean, it's not really up to her to come up with the mechanism, but a very interesting idea about government, or I guess you could try to find a way for private organizations to make this happen. But if you want people to comply with social distancing and staying home from school, work, or what have you, if they either suspect they have the virus or just want to help contribute to slowing the spread, I mean, I guess you can't really pay them for it. I just want to help. But if you're sick, certainly there's lots of people, and it's very easy to imagine situations in which people could become sick, knowing that there's this coronavirus circulating, even suspecting that they may have been exposed to it or may even have it, and simply saying, I just can't help you with social distancing and slowing down the spread of this virus. If I don't go, we're going to run out of money. I'm going to lose my apartment. I can't pay for the medications I need to try to take care of this illness, and it'll just get worse. I'll go home and give it to my family, and I won't be able to treat them either. So, I mean, bottom line is, yeah, somebody's going to have to find some way of coming up with, and certainly, well, I was going to say, they have to come up with money. I gather that, the way our government works, even if it were motivated to action, which I'm not certain that is possible, you would almost certainly be handed a solution in the form of, well, you can write it off on your taxes. Sometime next year, we'll give you back some of the money you lost. Some. But that doesn't really cut it for people who are living paycheck to paycheck, or maybe not even living paycheck to paycheck, but struggling to get there anyway. Yeah, I mean, it's going to require an outlay of money, and she makes a good point here. That's going to require an outlay of money to do things the hard way, too, and you might not even get people's cooperation. It may not work. You'll end up spending more on involuntary cooperation that doesn't work than you would. I mean, it's a pretty good motivator, money. And if you were able to, quite honestly, if you told people that your part in this is staying home and we're going to pay you to do so, I think most people would kind of jump at that chance. It can't be necessarily a general amnesty. Everybody gets paid and nobody goes to work for the next however long. I mean, that could just shut things down. But certainly, I guess even without going the route of saying, although it would make a good argument for it, let's talk once again about the necessity of a universal paid sick leave policy for everyone in the country, not to mention universal access to health care, affordable health care. But you could at least discuss it in the emergency situation. Well, okay, but only for this virus. Of course, then it, just comes down to, well, now you'll have to prove to the government on paperwork that you actually had this virus and not that virus. Everything comes with complications, but you have to start somewhere. Well, I'll tell you where you shouldn't start. Yesterday's big news, I think, was that, Chris Hayes summarized it nicely on Twitter yesterday. I guess we could read through the actual articles that reported the news, but I guess he had a nice summary of it. He put it this way. So here's what it appears to be the chain of events. The Trump administration repatriated infected Americans over the objections of the CDC. You'll recall that from a couple of days ago. Rescues, as they said, from the Diamond Princess cruise ship, bringing American citizens home from China and other places hard hit by the disease, and particularly lots of objection about the way things were done and suspicions along the way that, angry, blustery President Trump sitting behind his desk smashing the Diet Coke button, which, by the way, I understand the Coca-Cola Corporation announces that the supplies of Diet Coke could be restricted or interrupted due to the effects of the spread of the coronavirus as well, and that'll really get him upset. Now it's getting real for him, right? Even a 2% cutback in consumption of Diet Coke could be the tipping point for Trump. But I could see him blustering and yelling and ordering things to get done. We want those people brought home because we have the best medical care anywhere. We're very, very prepared, this country, and everybody would probably felt like they wanted to get home to the United States and American health care treatment for whatever reason. And I'm sure that he thought, as a man of action, a doer, a businessman in the White House, why don't we just, quote unquote, get things done? Send a plane, put everybody on the plane. I have my doubts about, I have my doubts about the how much of the story we're actually getting correct here. But then, of course, the fight over whether or not to put everybody on one plane. I guess for some reason the State Department thought it was imperative that those known to be infected with the virus, plus those simply being brought home to get them out of harm's way, all be put on the same plane, which seemed like a recipe for giving everybody on the plane who didn't already have the virus. And that the CDC thought, well, we ought to do this thing in stages. We should at least segregate them on planes. And, one infected plane and one non-infected plane might have been a good idea, for instance. Or those who are infected should remain in place and get their treatment where they are. But somehow the government decided everybody on one plane. And then, as it happens, as frequently does happen with outbreaks of a virus like this, everybody who worked on that project of bringing people home was then exposed. And it's like you couldn't have written it worse if you were writing a SNL sketch with Alec Baldwin as Trump. Here's my idea for the virus to keep everybody safe. Let's jam everybody together in a tight space for a couple of hours and then release them into the general population. Because that's what appears to have happened. It occurs to me that it's probably better to just simply read the article when we come back from our first break. There's a Washington Post article on it. There's a New York Times article on it. I'll grab one of them. But it appears that the people that we sent from the federal government to go and execute this operation of bringing all these people home from overseas were dispatched to the job and performed the job without any special equipment or training or warnings about what you should and shouldn't be doing when you're around people who have been exposed to the virus. And lo and behold, we're finding in California, as things begin to really explode out there, that people in the neighborhoods around the areas where they processed all the people that they repatriated are finding that they're infected with the virus. How did that happen? What a disaster. Hi, it's me, David Waldman, your host for Kagro in the Morning, and I've learned that I either need to update these announcements more often or stop saying that the announcements are brand new. What's not new is that this message, too, is a call for your support in keeping the Kagro in the Morning show on the air. My thanks go out to all of you who do support the show through your donations. The stats say that Kagro in the Morning fans download our program about 2,000 times each weekday, but our donors make up only about 8% of our daily listeners. Patreon.com, Patreon.com, makes it simple to make easy, secure, recurring monthly contributions to support our show. Patreon.com/KagroX gets you straight to our donation page. If we're helping keep you sane during the Trump era, consider what that's worth. $1 a day? 50 cents? One thin dime? We do about 20 shows a month, so pick a number, do the math, and head to patreon.com/KagroX to let us know. Thanks again, everyone, for all your support. Welcome back now to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Let's see what other fun things we need to do here. Oh, yes, right. Definitely wanted to give you the basic story from the Washington Post about this. Apparently, all this information comes out through yet another whistleblower in the Trump administration. So I guess more people are getting purged for that. But in the meantime, we learned a little something, and that's nice. U.S. workers without protective gear assisted coronavirus evacuees, HHS whistleblower says. You would think that in the Department of Health and Human Services, they would have had the good sense to tell people, you really need to protect yourself in this situation. And what's interesting is, I think it's mentioned in this article, whether it was this one or the New York Times one, I'm not certain. But at some point, the HHS personnel who were dispatched, and there's some interesting sort of bureaucratic news in there, like who at HHS would be sent to do something like this. Do they have a department for dealing with this? Well, kind of, sort of, but not really. But what was interesting was that they found themselves there working alongside people who had been dispatched from the CDC, and they were in protective gear. And I have questions about how you find yourself in a situation like that, working alongside people in protective gear and not saying to yourself, why do I not have protective gear? Although I understand that they did say that to themselves. And the problem is, then they began saying it to their bosses and saying, the CDC people appear to know what they're doing. That's their job. They're in protective gear. Why aren't we in protective gear? And I guess the answer was, shut up or you'll be fired. And, well, that's not so good. That's not a great answer. But in addition to that, even bringing up the subject, like you have to invoke whistleblower protections just to not be fired from your job for saying that other people ought to say something. But that, and also I guess I have questions, but if you can get fired for asking questions, I guess that's the real answer as to why people didn't do it. But I guess I also have questions about why the CDC people who arrived in protective gear, seeing others working alongside them without protective gear, didn't say, you can't be doing this, or here's some gear, or something. But I guess everybody's worried about being purged from the government these days, which is just another lesson in why Donald Trump is just simply, uniquely poorly suited to dealing with this sort of situation. The science is the science, and you just can't play the politics with it that way. All right, Lena H. Sun and Yasmin Abutaleb, if I've got the names correct here, are byliners on the Washington Post piece. Officials at the Department of Health and Human Services sent more than a dozen workers to receive the first Americans evacuated from Wuhan, China, the epicenter of the coronavirus outbreak, without proper training for infection control or appropriate protective gear. According to a whistleblower complaint, the workers did not show symptoms of infection and were not tested for the virus either, of course. According to lawyers for the whistleblower, a senior HHS official based in Washington who oversees workers at the Administration for Children and Families, a unit within HHS. Why send workers from Washington, from the Administration for Children and Families? Why send them anywhere? Well, apparently, I think they probably make mention in the story somewhere that the Administration for Children and Families personnel are often dispatched for dealing with disasters of some sort, natural disasters, or, the ones we make ourselves, but not so much for an illness outbreak. But here they were dispatched from Washington, and in most cases, I think, sent to the West Coast, where we used military bases in California to receive and process the people who had been evacuated from China and Japan. And all of that makes a certain amount of sense, of course. I don't know that necessarily if you're not going to send people with any training or equipment, I don't know why we also paid to fly them from Washington, D.C. to California to do that. But that's another question. And then, somewhere, I may not have an article on this one, but I saw last night's Twitter rumor mill apparently was that there were people who were being watched for suspected exposure to the virus in and around these few locations in California, which were oddly immediately adjacent to the military bases where we processed the evacuees. Gee, I wonder why that might have happened. The whistleblower is seeking federal protection, alleging she was unfairly and improperly reassigned after raising concerns about the safety of these workers to HHS officials. That was very fast for them to get rid of her, including those within the Office of the Health and Human Services Secretary, Alex Azar. She was told on February 19th that if she does not accept the new position in 15 days, which is March 5th, she would be terminated. So in other words, they reassigned her to some crappy job. They didn't fire her from the HHS, but they said, if you don't take the job mopping the bathrooms in our satellite building in, Greenbelt, Maryland, you'll be fired. So, that's the sort of thing from which a whistleblower might need protection. The whistleblower has decades of experience in the field, received 2 HHS department awards from Azar last year, and has received the highest performance evaluations, her lawyers said, which is why she should be mopping bathrooms. The complaint was filed Wednesday with the Office of the Special Counsel, an independent federal watchdog agency. The whistleblower's lawyers provided a copy of a redacted 24-page complaint to the Washington Post. That's a lot of complaint. I thought it got summed up nicely. They sent everybody here to there without any equipment or training, that's a bad idea. Repeat for 24 pages. But she obviously had some very specific evidence of wrongdoing to pass on. And by the way, no, I'm not speaking from any documentation here. I don't think she was assigned to mop bathrooms at a satellite building in Greenbelt, Maryland. But the idea was they were reassigning her, and it was pretty clear that it was a punishment. It's not the sort of thing, I mean, if it was a promotion, that's ordinarily not the sort of thing you have to threaten people. If you don't accept in 15 days, you're fired. So we're inferring a little bit about that one. A spokesman for the Office of the Special Counsel confirmed that it has received the complaint and assigned the case. The complaint alleges HHS staffers were improperly deployed and were not properly trained or equipped to operate in a public health emergency situation. The complaint also alleges the workers were potentially exposed to coronavirus because appropriate steps were not taken to protect them and staffers. They're not taken to protect them, and staffers were not trained in wearing personal protective equipment, even though they had face-to-face contact with returning passengers. It does seem awfully dumb, doesn't it? The workers were in contact with passengers in an airplane hangar where evacuees were received, and on two other occasions, boy, reading skills really suffering today, when they helped distribute keys for room assignments and hand out colored ribbons for identification purposes. Again, just to pause and comment on this a little bit, they flew people, it was all, if they had done this even with protective gear, honestly, flying people from Washington, D.C. to California for the purpose of handing out keys to evacuees for their room assignments and giving them colored ribbons for identification purposes. I feel like they could have found people in California to do that job, particularly if they weren't going to give them any protective gear. However, maybe beneficial labor law in California made it difficult to find people because they had the right to refuse that sort of stupid work. I don't know. I'm not really even sure how they came to this decision. I guess they thought, well, it is an infectious disease situation, and this Administration for Children and Families personnel, they don't often deal with illness outbreaks, so they don't have the training, but the things we're having them do are not that dissimilar from things that they may have been asked to do in the past, like helping to process and house refugees of sorts. It's just that these people are refugees because of the spread of an illness as opposed to because of the explosion of a gas line or an earthquake or something like that. And, well, I mean, in that sense, it's not much different from what they normally do. Although, again, I feel like there are probably people in California who could have done the job. But I guess if you say, well, it's not really that much different except that they're dealing with people who have this, highly transmissible illness, then you would say, oh, okay, well, then the one thing we really need to do in all of this is give them protective gear so that they don't get this illness. And that's the part we left out. That is awfully strange. In some instances, the teams were working alongside personnel from the CDC in full gown, gloves, and hazmat attire, the complaint said, which, again, I think should have raised questions on both sides. And apparently it raised questions at least on the HHS side for this person. We take all whistleblower complaints very seriously and are providing all the appropriate protections under the Whistleblower Protection Act. We are evaluating the complaint and have nothing further to add at this time, according to HHS spokeswoman Caitlin Oakley. The whistleblower in her complaint states that appropriate steps were not taken to quarantine, monitor, or test the workers during their deployment and upon their return home, which is just another angle on this whole thing. Remember that, in addition to probably being able to find people in California who could have done this job, you've now not only not done that and incurred the expense of flying people to and from Washington, D.C., but you've done so without protecting any of them. And so at the end of the day, you stick them in the airplane hangar with returning passengers from an infection zone, give them no protection, don't test them or follow up on any of them, and then put people who have been exposed to the virus on commercial airliners and fly them back to Washington, D.C. and drop them off there so that we can have a cluster of outbreaks here in and around the places where everyone who went to do this work lives, works, shops, goes to the movies, goes to restaurants, etc. What a fantastic way to spread the disease. Yeah. All right. So the whistleblower complains that of no appropriate steps taken for any of that during the work there or on their return home. The repatriated Americans were among those evacuated from Wuhan and quarantined on military bases in California and Texas because they were considered at high risk for contracting the flu-like illness, which, okay, I think, let's bring them back to our most populous states and plant them in small areas there and see what happens. I don't know. Maybe Alaska wasn't available. They're full up there. About 14 personnel from the Administration for Children and Families, or ACF, were sent to March Air Force Base in Riverside County, California. So if you're listening from Riverside County, California, I guess you can run around with your hair on fire if you like. You really shouldn't. 2% mortality rate and all that. And another team of about 13 ACF personnel were sent to Travis Air Force Base in Solano County, California, according to the complaint and the whistleblower's lawyer, Ari Wilkenfeld. In Solano County this week, the first U.S. patient was confirmed to be infected with coronavirus who did not travel to a region where it is spreading or have known contact with someone diagnosed with the disease. Except guess what? They had contact with someone diagnosed, or not even necessarily diagnosed with the disease. They just happened to get it from where we put all these people and then shipped in a bunch of people to hand out keys and ribbons to them with no protective gear. And then they went to 7-Eleven and got a Slurpee at the end of the shift and back to their hotel room. And somebody at the 7-Eleven or at the hotel or at the restaurant where they had dinner or taking the toll from them on the way in between the airplane hangar and the hotel, whatever it is. Gee whiz, how could that possibly be? I mean, I guess that's all you really need to hear, right? We stored the evacuees in Solano County, California, and now someone in Solano County, California, who didn't work on processing these evacuees is sick with the disease. And golly, how did that happen? Several people within HHS voiced objections to sending ACF personnel to receive passengers, according to a person familiar with the conversations, who spoke on the condition of anonymity to discuss private deliberations. A second person familiar with the situation said the workers were not tested for coronavirus because none of them met the criteria, which was restricted at that time to people with symptoms and either a recent trip to China or close contact with a person confirmed to be infected with COVID-19. If the workers had exhibited symptoms, appropriate protocol would have been followed. So it's your fault for not exhibiting the symptoms at the right time, you dummies. I mean, I see procedurally how that could happen, but it's quite annoying. The deployments took place January 28th to 31st, around the time when the first plane loads of evacuees arrived at March. That's very confusing because the name of the Air Force Base is March, and we're talking about dates in January and February. I didn't realize that they arrived so long ago. I thought it was much more recent, but maybe it's that they're being released now. But again, end of January is when the deployments took place, around the time when the first plane load of evacuees arrived at this Air Force Base, and also on February 2nd to 7th, during the time when additional flights were arriving at Travis Air Force Base. The planes, I think they're both Air Force bases. The planes each carried about 200 Americans who were repatriated from Wuhan. After the deployments, the workers returned to their normal duties, which is fine if they were wearing protective gear and were tested, but not if they weren't. And, of course, some took commercial airline flights to return to their offices around the country. And I don't know whether they were all from Washington, D.C., but, it's like you're, again, like writing an SNL skit. How will we handle the evacuees? Well, let's bring in some people from New York, some from Boston, some from Washington, D.C., a few from Atlanta. How about some from Kansas City, St. Louis, Minneapolis? Take some from... how about some Las Vegas, Dallas, what have you? Bring them all in and then send them all home on commercial airliners. Like you did it intentionally. It's very strange. Let's see. So everybody goes back to their offices around the country, and that's not a good idea. Our client was concerned that ACF staff, who were potentially exposed to the coronavirus, were allowed to leave quarantined areas and return to their communities where they may have spread the coronavirus to others. Duh, said Lauren Naylor, one of the whistleblower's lawyers. She didn't say the duh part. The whistleblower is also seeking assistance from the office of Representative Jimmy Gomez of California, a member of the House Ways and Means Committee and vice chair of the House Oversight Committee, according to a Gomez spokesman. During a hearing Thursday, Gomez asked Azar whether any employees from ACF could have been sent to help with the repatriation of Americans from Wuhan without any training in emergency response. Azar replied that some ACF employees were involved. That's not really a good... Were they sent without training? They were involved. Asked what sort of health and safety training the personnel received and whether any of them were exposed to high-risk evacuees from China, Azar said, they never should have been without PPE, referring to personal protective equipment. Well, that's true, but they were. Asked whether any protocols may have been broken, given the urgency on the ground. That's a good excuse. Azar replied, urgency was never a reason for breaking safety protocols. It's not, but they were giving you an out, but he didn't take it. I don't believe that has taken place, Azar said, adding that health and safety protocols should always be followed. He said he did not personally know the names of the team, but other department officials did. Pressed by Gomez what the department would do if untrained employees were exposed to the virus, Azar said, I'd want to know the full facts and we'd take appropriate remedial efforts. Well, that's all well and good, but are you going to go and do that now? I guess not, is the answer. All right, let's see. The whistleblower said she received an email on January 25th about a potential deployment within ACF to support repatriation of the evacuated Americans, according to her lawyer. Okay. She initially supported the efforts, because why not? Because they had the appearance that this was within ACF's scope, Naylor said. It's not usually what we do, but okay, passing out keys and ribbons, we can do that. But later, she discovered the teams were dispatched without her knowledge by other senior officials at HHS. It was part of the agency's all-hands-on-deck mission, Naylor said, but it broke agency protocol about what kinds of employees should respond to health emergencies. The whistleblower said she later found out about the deployment when she heard directly from some employees and other senior officials at HHS. At the water cooler, right? Did you hear about Joe? No, what happened? He got sent to March Air Force Base to process evacuees from Wuhan, and he's dead. That's not, of course, what actually the conversation happened. Nobody died, as far as I know, from any of this. But yeah, he was sent out there, and he came back, and he was like, they didn't give us a mask. They didn't give us anything. I don't know whether I'm sick. And just some poor administrator there, just like, I swear I emailed everybody about how this wasn't going to work. Or why didn't they tell me? These are people who are, as they say in the office setting, these are people who are direct reports to my direct reports or whatever. I supervise these people, or I'm nominally responsible for these people. And they didn't ask me whether it's, I was fine with them going and doing this, but I assumed they were giving them masks or something. Some workers expressed concern about the lack of protective gear to the ACF team leader on the ground, people that were actually there with them. That person joined ACF in September and had no training or experience in any federal emergency management, public health emergency response, or safety or operational protocols to run the mission, the complaint states. And even that all by itself, like I could imagine saying, all right, well, I've only been here since September, but what's the job? Our people are going to hand out keys and ribbons. So fine. The problem there is that they say, well, this breaks our protocol. If we don't ordinarily handle infectious disease outbreaks, but if we do, shouldn't we have a mask or something? And the answer from somebody who's brand new and has no training or experience, the answer is, I don't know whether that's protocol or not. It seems like we should have masks, but I don't know whether it's breaking any protocol or anything. And so, you got people who are saying, well, the book, the manual says we don't do this unless we have XYZ, right? So isn't this one of those situations? And if the person in charge is like, I'm brand new, man, I don't know. Well, couldn't you ask your supervisor? I don't even know really how to file that. I don't have form XYZ 99F. I don't know what to do. But people are sick and we got to help them. You could see, I guess, how in a perfect storm situation, you could end up doing something like this. But man, honestly, are we really the best people for this? ACF personnel typically deal with supporting people recovering from natural disasters, such as floods and fires, and helping victims apply for temporary assistance, all of which are under the category of human services, the whistleblower's lawyers said. HHS officials broke established protocols for emergency support by sending ACF workers to a health emergency for which they have no training, Naylor said. And why would they have any training? Because, we don't want people just standing around doing nothing. They'd be trained for no reason, right? What if they never have to respond to a healthcare emergency? So don't train anybody, according to the Trump management theory. ACF, which has about 1,300 employees, has been criticized in recent years because of its role in sheltering and taking custody of migrant children who crossed the U.S.-Mexico border and were separated from family members by the Department of Homeland Security. A whole different story there. The workers' concerns about potential exposure to coronavirus were not addressed, the whistleblower's lawyers said. She was involuntarily assigned to a position in a subject matter where she has no expertise, which is how we got into this problem in the first place. Wilkenfeld, her lawyer, said in an interview on Thursday. So in addition to having a supervisor at ACF who was untrained and had no idea what to do in this situation, we're going to take one person from ACF who did know what to do, but wasn't assigned to this job, but said we should have done things differently, and assign her to something with which she has no experience so that we could have another problem elsewhere. What a great solution. The agency said the reason for the reassignment was necessary to meet the needs of the department, according to a memo she received. If I did not accept involuntary reassignment, I would be terminated from federal service through adverse personnel action, according to her complaint. So, not a good start to all of this. And I guess that's where Chris Hayes came in with his summary, saying, so here's what appears, just to wrap it all up, here's what appears to be the chain of events. The Trump administration repatriated infected Americans over the objections of the CDC. HHS then sent federal workers to interact with the infected population without adequate training or protection. Then those workers went out into the public with no monitoring or testing regime in place. And now, the first U.S. contracted case has appeared right near one of the Air Force bases where this all happened. When someone at HHS raised alarms about all this, she was criticized for hurting morale and then ordered to another position or be fired. This is real bad. And I guess that sums it up. It is real bad. Anyway, that seems kind of nuts, but we'll be dealing with the fallout of that over the weekend as well. Switching subjects, and why not? Let's see. We have just a minute or two before we jump out on yet another break. I'll update you on something that's got nothing to do with any of this, but that you might find interesting. Mike Scarcella, a senior editor at law.com, and other places, has this news from the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. Joe Arpaio, back in the news, now pardoned by Trump, of course, has lost his bid to vacate his criminal contempt verdict. This, according to the decision just posted from the Ninth Circuit, which in relevant part here reads, by the way, this is a decision of a very conservative and Trump-leaning panel of the Ninth Circuit. The decision written by Judge J. Bybee, as a matter of fact, whose name may ring a bell with lots of you, a unanimous ruling with newly named Judge Daniel Collins, a Trump appointee, and Senior Judge N. Randy Smith, all three judges on the panel, Republican appointed. Bybee, I think, was wrapped up in the torture memos of the George W. Bush administration. I think that's where his name rings a bell from. The court appointed a special prosecutor in the case after the Department of Justice backed Arpaio in all of this. The decision language is kind of boring, but let me grab the law.com write-up of it just to give you some flavor of it as we exit towards the new break here. U.S. Justice Department, giving you the background, will back in December of 2017, the decision to back Joe Arpaio in his appeal to erase his contempt verdict. Again, remember what's going on here. He was convicted of contempt of court for failing to comply with court orders in the way he treated people under detention under his jurisdiction. And Trump pardoned him, but part of the deal in getting the pardons is, all right, well, we'll pardon you from the punishment from this point forward, but you kind of have to acknowledge that you did do the crime. And he wanted that expunged from his record. And basically, the Court of Appeals here is saying, yeah, that's not actually the way things work. And you're not entitled to go around pretending like you didn't do this thing and it never happened. You just should enjoy your good luck at not having to serve any jail time with it. So that's where it stands. All right, welcome back now to the Kagro Morning Show here on Netroots Radio. Just for our information here, as I brought up here, the law.com write-up, the actual write-up has been archived, so I can't actually get it. I have to go through LexisNexis, to which I do not have access. But they do provide a link here to this very strange decision by the Department of Justice. I just wanted to go back and double back and make sure you all understood that this was the case. It's well accepted that you don't get a pardon if and you don't have to accept a pardon, but one of the, I gather, I've never been offered a federal pardon, but I gather from the discussion of it, and we've discussed these things in the past, that you have to kind of say, yes, I mean, I don't deny that I was convicted of this thing, I just don't want to, I'm glad I'll be pardoned from serving time on it. It doesn't mean that it didn't happen, but it was Arpaio's, I thought, rather novel interpretation of things. That, well, if I'm pardoned, that means I shouldn't have a record of being even charged with this thing. We should get rid of all of this. But as it turns out, it's not that novel an interpretation, I suppose, because at some point the DOJ lets the court know that it's going to appear in the proceedings in support of this strange and stupid idea that Arpaio's criminal contempt verdict and other rulings should be expunged. And they entered this memo, I guess summarizing that. I mean, this is not that all that long. The government provides the following statement in response to the order issued by the court on November 22nd, 2017. The government has entered an appearance in this case and intends to represent the government's interests in this appeal. The government does not intend to defend the district court's order from October 19th, 2017, in which the court denied defendant appellant Joseph Arpaio's motion to vacate. Instead, the government intends to argue, as it did in the district court, that the motion to vacate should have been granted. We take no position on whether the court should appoint counsel to make any additional arguments. Signed here by John Cronin, Acting Assistant Attorney General. Where they get the idea that that was proper, I am unsure. Apparently, the Third Circuit or Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals didn't know either. I guess we'll read their boring language here from Judge Bybee. Defendant appellant Joseph Arpaio, the former sheriff of Maricopa County, Arizona, was found guilty of criminal contempt in a bench trial for willfully violating a preliminary injunction prohibiting him from enforcing federal civil immigration law. After entry of the verdict, but before the court could sentence Arpaio, he was granted a pardon by the president. Arpaio asked the district court to vacate the verdict and dismiss the criminal case against him with prejudice. The district court granted the motion to dismiss the case with prejudice, but refused to vacate the verdict. Arpaio appeals that decision, arguing that vacatur was required under the Supreme Court's decision in United States v. Munsingware Incorporated, a 1950 case that I remember appearing in my books, but other than that, I can't recall anything about it. Because we find that Munsingware does not apply in this case, we affirm the judgment of the lower court. I don't know. Just sort of another, I guess you really need to file this under the politicization of the Department of Justice files, that they would be dispatched to defend this otherwise baseless assertion by Joe Arpaio, of all people, that he not only should get off scot-free, but should never have been charged in the first place. And things don't work that way, and what are you going to do? But well, all right, at least the Ninth Circuit appears to agree. All right, let's see. Slight shift in focus here. I wanted to take a look at this piece in The Hill from Olivia Beavers. Trump shakes up Justice Department and intelligence community. We've been talking about that for a couple of days, and I thought they had some interesting new additions to the facts here, if I recall correctly. President Trump, it says here in normalizing language, is challenging two institutions with crucial roles to play in the next election, with a controversial appointment to the intelligence community and tweets directed at the Justice Department. This is generally just sort of summing up what we've learned over the last couple of days, I think, but in an interesting way. The intelligence appointment underscored Trump's priority of loyalty over experience, according to critics, which used to be considered a major grounds for impeachment, really, honestly, but we never did get around to that impeachment. Still regretting the skinny impeachment idea of focusing on Ukraine only, but there we are. But remember, it was once a major scandal that Trump would demand loyalty from the FBI director, and apparently not a major scandal anymore when he demands it from the Director of National Intelligence. But anyway, the Intel appointment underscored Trump's priority of loyalty over experience, while the tweets complicated proceedings at the Justice Department while creating turmoil for Attorney General William Barr. This has led to stringent criticisms. Is criticism stringent, really? That he is weakening the Justice Department and intelligence community. True. Bad on its own, but they also happen to be two institutions with crucial roles to play in the next election. You're seeing a real strain on these institutions, and the strain is coming in the form of really challenging the norms, to put it mildly, under which they've operated in the past, said Lisa Monaco, who served as Assistant Attorney General for National Security during the Obama administration. The appointment of Richard Grenell last week to serve as acting director of national intelligence came under fierce criticism from Democrats and other observers, and probably some Republicans too. Grenell has been serving as U.S. ambassador to Germany and regularly offers vociferous defenses of Trump and attacks on his critics in the media, but he has little intelligence experience, or little intelligence, if you really want to be serious about things. He plainly is completely incompetent to be acting DNI. That's a position that, if you're going to be nominated officially, you need extensive intelligence experience. And that's enclosed in quotes, extensive intelligence experience. He has none. said Glenn Kirshner, whose name we've called before, a former federal prosecutor who served in the U.S. Attorney's Office for D.C. for 24 years. The move followed Attorney General William Barr's intervention in a sentencing recommendation by the Justice Department against Roger Stone, a longtime friend and co-conspirator of Trump, one day after the president called the 7 to 9 year recommendation a horrible and very unfair situation. Barr has since criticized the president's tweets, but that has done little to mollify critics who believe the decision to change the sentencing recommendation was politicized. Every member of the Justice Department's prosecuting team in the Stone case resigned from it after the recommendation switch. Trump's efforts to strengthen his control come 1 month after House Democrats tried to impeach and remove him from office over allegations he pressured Ukraine to investigate political foes, and should have been 10 other things in that. And that's a low ball. There are now new questions about Russian interference in this year's elections, something the Intelligence Committee and Justice Department would be expected to police. It says Intelligence Committee, but I think they mean Intelligence Community, but also the Intelligence Committee and the Justice Department would be expected to police. Former Justice Department officials described Barr's intervention in the Stone case as unprecedented. I don't think we even really care about that. I'm sure it is, but what do you want to know? Monaco says she's never seen anything like it. There. That doesn't really add that much. Now, it really becomes interesting, the paragraph after this. Republicans have pushed back on claims of political interference, arguing that Barr's Justice Department has a record of independence in its prosecution decisions, including choosing not to charge former FBI Director Andrew McCabe, whose role in the start of the 2016 Russia counterintelligence probe came under scrutiny. Do you see what's being said here? Just a moment. All right. Just to be clear about this, what they're saying is Barr's Justice Department has a record of independence. What is that record? Why, just look. We chose not to prosecute Andrew McCabe. Yes, that is true. But the person who made the decision not to charge Andrew McCabe has been fired from the Justice Department. Yes, but the Justice Department made that decision and didn't do it. They didn't prosecute. They stood by the decision so far, anyway. I mean, and they haven't, by the way, stood by the decision. They've brought in U.S. attorneys from elsewhere around the country to re-examine the decision not to prosecute McCabe. Is that not right? I mean, I know that they've been re-examining a bunch of their otherwise closed cases to see if they can reopen them. But I was under the impression that the McCabe case was one of them. So honestly, standing there and saying, well, we have a record of independence because we didn't prosecute McCabe. True, but the person who didn't do it got fired, and we're reviewing that decision. That doesn't really stand to reason. But I guess you can just say anything you want about the situation now, because the next paragraph is a quote from John Ratcliffe, who, as we know, is back under consideration for that DNI job. And so I guess in auditioning for a renomination to the permanent DNI job, Ratcliffe is out there saying anything he can to, be on the president's side. He worked very hard during the impeachment process to get on television so that Trump would see him being loyal to Trump and rehabilitate his reputation in Trump world. I mean, he can't rehabilitate his reputation outside of Trump world. He's unqualified to be DNI himself. He lied about his record and really did so in a way that borders on, an analog of stolen valor. It wasn't a military claim, but his claim to have prosecuted counterintelligence cases and to have prosecuted, wasn't he making claims about having personally been involved in a roundup of of undocumented immigrants that one isn't really actually shouldn't be considered a claim to fame, and two, he didn't really do. So he doesn't get out from under that with normal people. But all he really needs is that audience of one, Donald Trump, to rehabilitate him and say, I'm going to nominate him to the position regardless, and then go twist arms. I mean, I guess he just figures, I just saw Republican senators deny a mountain of evidence of my guilt straight on, presented directly to their faces. And if they were willing to do that, then maybe they would be willing to say, well, we'll muster a majority to put Ratliff in at DNI if the president says he wants that, despite a mountain of evidence that says he doesn't belong there. I don't know if that really follows from the question of removing a Republican president from office through impeachment. That doesn't necessarily translate to give that same president anything he wants because, well, impeachment and removal from office is embarrassing, and losing this vote would also be embarrassing. Therefore, you'll do both. The stakes are not the same, but I don't think that means anything to Trump. Anyway, here's Ratcliffe's quote. When I said you can just say anything, I mean, this is really it. Ready for this quote? In the face of all of this, everything you already know and everything I just told you, that the McCabe case represents independence of the DOJ, despite the fact that there's no question but that it does not. He says, how can you argue that Bill Barr is doing anything but depoliticizing the Department of Justice? Said Representative John Ratcliffe, Republican of Texas, an ally of the president, whose name has been floated as a possible permanent DNI appointee. Again, how can you argue that Bill Barr is doing anything but depoliticizing the Department of Justice? When you look at the facts, ladies and gentlemen, and I guess the fact is supposed to be, again, Andrew McCabe was not prosecuted. How could you possibly say he's not depoliticizing justice? Well, because he fired the person who opted not to file the charges against McCabe and is reopening the question of whether they should. That is actually politicizing. But how could anybody argue that he's doing anything but depoliticizing? Well, because he's doing the opposite. That's how. Yeah, but didn't you hear me? How can you? I mean, I don't know what to say to that. He called Barr the same guy whose department did not prosecute Andrew McCabe or Jim Comey, despite criminal referrals from the Inspector General. Comey, of course, former FBI director who has feuded with Trump, they helpfully remind us. So the idea that Barr is a Trump loyalist or apologist, to me, isn't supported at all by those fact patterns, Ratcliffe told The Hill. Is that the guy you want interpreting intelligence to try to keep us safe from terrorist attack or more Russian interference in our elections? I guess if you're Donald Trump, the answer is yes. But if you're anybody else, duh. Democrats have long felt distrust towards Barr, the article continues, particularly after the Attorney General carefully choreographed the release of former Special Counsel Robert Mueller's report to argue he is constantly seeking to protect Trump. Barr released a 4-page memo laying out the report's main conclusions, which they weren't, before the final report was made public, which claimed Trump did not obstruct justice, an assertion Mueller did not make in his report. While Barr has criticized Trump's tweets as making his job more difficult, the president has shown no signs of changing his behavior. On Tuesday, he criticized the jury forewoman overseeing the Stone case, accusing her of bias. You heard about that one. U.S. District Court Amy Berman Jackson, in a hearing, scolded Trump and others in the media for criticizing the juror. While critics have worried that Trump's actions will influence judicial proceedings, Ian Pryor, a former Justice Department spokesman under then Attorney General Jeff Sessions, said he hasn't seen any such evidence. But he did say it makes work harder at the Justice Department. I can speak from experience here. The tweets made our job harder. How? We don't know. They just did. Not because they feel they have to change their actions to appease the president. Rather, What makes it harder is that every time there's a tweet, it creates a massive firestorm, which everybody has to deal with, from the Office of Public Affairs up through the Deputy Attorney General's office and the Attorney General's office, which is a distraction, he said. I see. Trump allies defended his appointment of Grinnell, arguing he's a fine pick. Let's see. Matt Gaetz says he rejected the premise that Grinnell's appointment was somehow a challenge to DNI. I don't think it challenges institutions at DNI to employ Rick Grinnell, someone who will do a fine job in the interim, he said. That doesn't even really say anything. It's unclear whom Trump will name as permanent replacement for the DNI role, but sources confirm he's in discussions with 4 to 5 contenders, including Ratcliffe and Representative Chris Stewart of Utah. One source said U.S. Ambassador to the Netherlands, Pete Hoekstra, is the leading contender. The White House has indicated a decision will be made over the next few weeks, so you know what to do with that. Soon, very soon. Some former national security officials say they are worried that Trump may seek to install Grinnell in his acting role longer than the Federal Vacancies Act allows by naming a successor who would face a tough confirmation battle. Oh, that's interesting, right? Once his, 200 and something, 290 days? Is that the number? I can't remember what the number actually is. And I guess, again, statutorily, at the end of that number of days, Grinnell can't serve any longer unless he's serving only as an interim while the permanent nominee's consideration is pending. And if that consideration just stays pending for the rest of Trump's term in office, well then, not so much we can do about that. Okay, another warping of the statutory requirements in order to get what he wants in the end. Anyway, doing so could allow, of course, Trump to keep Grinnell into the acting role longer than March 11th. Wow, that's actually a pretty quick turnaround. March 11th. I don't know. Well, let me read on here. Whether intentional or unintentional, the White House may be using the nomination process to keep Grinnell in place at least until the elections, said Ryan Goodman, who served as special counsel at the Department of Defense during the Obama administration. Even if someone like Ratcliffe is promptly rejected by the Senate, that would restart the clock, and Grinnell could remain in place for, at the very least, another 6 months, Goodman told The Hill. Well, I guess that's the mechanism by which it would work. And you just keep nominating people. I guess that maybe that's why Ratcliffe's nomination is under consideration again, even if Republicans in the Senate would prefer to reject it. It provides a mechanism for keeping Grinnell in place without violating the law, or quote unquote, without violating the law. You tell me whether you think he's violating the law in doing things this way intentionally or not. Okay, let's see. So much more to get to. We can move on to a couple other pieces here. How about this one? This is an interesting one. Just to switch over to international relations for just a moment. We'll go to the Monkey Cage blog that Greg likes to use so often from the Washington Post, but not Sarah Binder this time, but rather, where's our byline? John Curiel and Jack Williams writing an interesting piece. Bit of a switch here. Actually, we'll pretend that it's an early airing of the West Coast Cookbook and Speakeasy. How about that? This is something that you'd be likely to hear about from Justice Putnam. Maybe we'll save him the time, or maybe we'll just duplicate efforts. But this was kind of interesting, I thought. Monkey Cage covering this one. Bolivia dismissed its October elections as fraudulent. Vaguely remember that because I pay no attention to anything. Our research found no reason to suspect fraud. Isn't that weird? More allegations of voter fraud, this time not here in the United States, but in Bolivia. The newly elected president of Bolivia has to be ignored, overthrown, replaced at the behest of the United States and the Organization of American States because voter fraud. Except people checked it out, and guess what? No voter fraud. So what do you do now? The subheader, Bolivians will hold a new election in May without ousted President Evo Morales. That's pretty incredible. What do you do about that? As Bolivia gears up for a do-over election on May 3rd, the country remains in unrest, as you can imagine, following the November 10th military-backed coup against incumbent President Evo Morales. How anti-democratic. Since we're in the middle of accusing each other of being anti-democratic here in the United States, thought I'd add that. A quick recap. Good, we need it. Morales claimed victory in October's election, but the opposition protested about what it called electoral fraud. It's linked here so you can get a story about what exactly they say happened. A November 10th report from the Organization of American States, whom we're supposed to be able to trust, noted election irregularities, which leads the technical audit team to question the integrity of the results of the election on October 20th. Police then joined the protests, and Morales sought asylum in Mexico. The military-installed government charged Morales with sedition and terrorism. Wow. A European Union monitoring report noted that some 40 former electoral officials have been arrested and face criminal charges of sedition and subversion, and 35 people have died in the post-electoral conflict. The highest polling presidential candidate, a member of Morales' Movimiento al Socialismo, do you see what's happening here? That's the name of the party, has received a summons from prosecutors for undisclosed crimes. That seems convenient. A move some analysts suspect was aimed at keeping him off the ballot. The media has largely reported the allegations of fraud as fact. And many commentators have justified the coup as a response to electoral fraud by the Movimiento al Socialismo, or MASIPSP is the abbreviation by which we call the party here in the United States. However, as specialists in election integrity, the writers here, we find that the statistical evidence does not support the claim of fraud in Bolivia's October election. Next section here, the OAS claimed that election fraud had happened. The primary support for claims of fraud was this OAS report. The organization's auditors claimed to have found evidence of fraud following a halt in the preliminary count, the non-binding election night results meant to track progress before the official count. The Bolivian constitution requires that a candidate either earn an outright electoral majority, all right, it's becoming an issue these days, or 40% of the votes with at least a 10 percentage point lead. Otherwise, a runoff election will take place. The preliminary count halted with 84% of the vote counted when Morales had a 7.87 percentage point lead. Though the halt was consistent with election officials' earlier promise to count at least 80% of the preliminary vote on election night and continue through the official count, the OAS quickly expressed concern over the stop. When the preliminary count resumed, Morales' margin was above the 10 percentage point threshold. The OAS claimed that halting the preliminary count resulted in a highly unlikely trend in the margin in favor of MASIPSP, the party again, when the count resumed. The OAS reported deep concern and surprise at the drastic and hard-to-explain change in the trend of the preliminary results. Adopting a novel approach to fraud analysis, the OAS claimed that high deviations in data reported before and after the cutoff would indicate potential evidence of fraud. Next section, but the statistical analysis behind this claim is problematic. The OAS report is in part based on forensic evidence that OAS analysts say points to irregularities, in other words, circumstantial evidence of irregularities, which includes allegations of forged signatures and alteration of tally sheets, a deficient chain of custody, and a halt in the preliminary vote count. Crucially, the OAS claimed in reference to the halt in the preliminary vote count that an irregularity on that scale is a determining factor in the outcome in favor of Morales, which acted as the primary quantitative evidence to their allegations of clear manipulation of the TREP system. I imagine that's the preliminary vote counting system, which affected the results of both that system and the final count. We, however, do not evaluate whether these irregularities point to deliberate interference or reflect the problems of an underfunded system with poorly trained election officials. Instead, we comment on the statistical evidence, that being, of course, the underlying basis of that OAS report. We'll bring you their analysis of the OAS analysis after this. Hi everybody, it's me, David. Let's change things up from the old fundraising pitch for just a minute and talk instead about how you can be a part of our show. If you've got a smartphone or any other electronic recording device, why not sit down and record a segment for us? Read us an important article and give us your take. Read one of your own original essays, or even just give us your commentary on something you'd like to share that's important to you. Then send the file to me at kagrox@gmail.com and I'll try and work it into the show. Short segments, a few minutes in length, are easiest to fit in. And of course, I can't always guarantee that I'll be able to play everything, but if you've ever shouted at your radio or TV about something you wish was being covered, here's your chance to change that. Make the show your own. Send your submissions to me at kagrox@gmail.com. Welcome back to the Kagro in the Morning Show here on Networks Radio. We'll continue with this sort of interesting story about maybe we possibly were sold a totally upside-down bill of goods on the Bolivian election. But, of course, you can't get people in the United States to care about that, but we'll give it a shot anyway. Taking a look here at the analysis in the Monkey Cage blog at the Washington Post. We continue on with this story. Since Morales had surpassed the 40% threshold, the key question was whether his vote tally was 10 percentage points higher than that of his closest competitor. If not, then Morales would be forced into a runoff election against his closest competitor, former President Carlos Mesa. Our results were straightforward. There does not seem to be a statistically significant difference in the margin before and after the halt of the preliminary vote. That's pretty straightforward. That was the whole claim, right? Instead, it is highly likely that Morales surpassed the 10 percentage point margin in the first round. How did we get there? The OAS approach relies on dual assumptions: that the unofficial account accurately reflects the vote continuously measured, and that reported voter preferences do not vary by time of day. If these assumptions are true, then a change in the trend to favor one party over time could potentially indicate fraud had occurred. The OAS cites no previous research demonstrating that these assumptions hold. There are reasons to believe that voter preferences and reporting can vary over time, with people who work voting later in the day, for instance. Areas where impoverished voters are clustered may have longer lines and less ability to count and report vote totals quickly. These factors may well apply in Bolivia, where there are severe gaps in infrastructure and income between urban and rural areas. Was there a discontinuity between the votes counted before and after the unofficial count? For sure, discontinuities might be evidence of tampering. In Russia, for instance, one allegation is that local elections officials stuff ballot boxes to meet preset targets. If the OAS finding was correct, we would expect to see Morales' vote margin spike shortly after the preliminary vote count halted, and the resulting election margin over his closest competitor would be too large to be explained by his performance before the preliminary count stopped. We might expect to see other anomalies, such as sudden shifts in votes for Morales from precincts that were previously less inclined to vote for him. We didn't find any evidence of any of these anomalies, as, they say, this figure shows. They included a graph that, I guess if you're inclined to reading or experience in reading such graphs, you would look at it and instantly say, yes, I know exactly what they're talking about. What it does show is a pretty tight cluster of its data around a pretty clear and well-defined line, a straight line at that I guess is, what are we charting here? Morales's final margin, according to the official count, versus on the y-axis, I guess, right? The x-axis shows the margin for Morales before the cutoff within the preliminary count, and the y-axis, the final margin, as reported within the official count. The high correlation between the preliminary count and the final vote suggests that no significant irregularities in the election count or Morales's final vote margin took place. So, yeah, I mean, it's a pretty straightforward line, and like I said, the cluster around the line is pretty close. There are outliers, of course, but they are few and far between versus the very dark space around this line by the clusters of this data. Anyway, you'll have to take a look at it yourself. But as they explain it, they didn't find any such evidence of these anomalies. We find a 0.946 correlation between Morales's margin between results before and after the cutoff in precincts counted before and after the cutoff. There is little observable difference between precincts in the results before and after the vote, after the count halt, suggesting that there weren't any significant irregularities. We and other scholars within the field reached out to the OAS for comment, and guess what? They didn't respond. We also ran 1,000 simulations to see if the difference between Morales's vote and the tally for the second place candidate could be predicted using only the votes verified before the preliminary count halted. In our simulations, we found that Morales could expect at least a 10.49 point lead over his closest competitor, above the necessary 10 percentage point threshold necessary to win outright. Again, this suggests that any increase in Morales's margin after the stop can be explained entirely by the votes already counted. Next section, there isn't statistical support for the claims of vote fraud. I thought that really was pretty much well explained in the previous section, but let's see what else they have to say. There's not any statistical evidence of fraud that we can find. The trends in the preliminary count, the lack of any big jump in support for Morales after the halt, and the size of Morales's margin all appear legitimate. All in all, the OAS's statistical analysis and conclusions would appear deeply flawed. Previous research published here in the monkey cage finds, and that's going to hurt when you're, I wonder if that hurts anything. If you go back to Bolivia and you tell people, well, this research proves that there wasn't any tampering with the vote counts. Oh yeah? Where's the research from? The monkey cage. Yeah, better to say the Washington Post on that one, quite honestly. Anyway, previous research that they've published finds that economic and racial differences make it difficult to verify voter registration in the United States, resulting in higher use of provisional ballots among Democrats and greater support for Democratic candidates among votes counted after Election Day. Under the OAS criteria for fraud, it's possible that U.S. elections in which votes that are counted later tend to lean Democratic might also be classified as fraudulent. Of course, electoral fraud is a serious problem, but relying on unverified tests as proof of fraud is a serious threat to any democracy. Interesting, worth keeping in mind, and particularly that last paragraph, I guess is probably a good look at where pro-Trump pseudo-intellectuals might be planning to rest their case for the election of any Democratic contender in the 2020 elections in November to be based on fraud. After all, take a look. According to the criteria that the Organization of American States found to invalidate the obviously fraudulent, to be read, not fraudulent at all, elections in Bolivia, and everyone believed that, right? Well, if you believe that, then you've got to believe that since we use the same criteria, the results of the American election are invalid as well. Of course, no one will believe that, but Donald Trump will. And that might be enough for him just to sit there and say, well, no one can pick me up and carry me. I've been guaranteeing that by eating as much cherry vanilla ice cream as possible. So no forklift can move me. Therefore, I'm the president of the United States again. I guess that's a theory you could go with. We'll see whether it works. All right. Among the many other things which we might consider, there are so many here. Let's see. Well, there are a few that have to do, since we're heading into the South Carolina primary tomorrow. Perhaps we could talk a little bit about what's shaping up in the nomination contest here in the United States. I thought some interesting Twitter threads, some shared with me as part of the conversation, and others not, but which I observed from a distance, that I thought we might want to share. I mentioned to you the other day my conversation with the Twitter friend known as Frankly Pants, and everyone loves that. If you thought Monkey Blog was a problem for credibility, maybe Frankly Pants doesn't do anything for that either, but neither does my stupid handle, so we ignore all of that stuff. But I got a comment here which begins the conversation this way. Longtime fan here, and we appreciate that. Think you just hit on the issue in this morning's pod, and I guess this was February 24th. That would have been Monday, so we waited until Friday to read all the way through this. Think you hit on an issue in this morning's podcast, reflecting on the whole, put an awful lot of into building the vehicle that Bernie Sanders now intends to use. You remember the discussion that we were having? What we must have been talking about at the time was the reluctance that the people who, many, but not all, Bernie Sanders supporters like to label for ease of use, if not offhand dismissal necessarily, the Democratic establishment. We're never really sure exactly what that means, et cetera, et cetera. But the idea that the Democratic establishment was rigging things either this time, last time, both times, what that might mean. No one knows exactly, but everybody has some suspicions. Rigging the system such that it would deny the nomination to Bernie Sanders. This is a renewed concern this time around, as early in the process as it is. You can't really talk about there being a front runner in the race without acknowledging that front runner at the moment, I guess, presumably has to be considered to be Bernie Sanders. And it sounds like I'm trying to do anything I can to deny him that label. I'm just being my normal cautious self. Can you do this in the Senate? Yes, but also no. Or no, but yes, if you really want to break all the rules. I just considering all the possibilities here. Another way of saying this is Bernie Sanders is the front runner. That may change. That may not change. It's early, but then again, who cares? So there you go. Does that make you feel any better about it? I don't think that reassured anybody, but maybe it keeps people involved in the conversation. And this conversation here is about bridging the gap and being able to have these conversations without alienating people right off the bat. It's a difficult thing to do. Twitter, not a very good forum for it. Is there really a good forum for it? If there is, it's me apologizing for 20 minutes, trying to get out the statement of, well, right now Bernie Sanders appears to be leading in some states, and that's just give you an idea of how difficult it is to have these conversations piece by piece with limited characters and in a forum where anybody can jump in and yell at any or both of the participants in the conversation uninvited. It's not a great forum for having this discussion, but we had a nice one. But Frankly Pants here saying that, I was interested in what you had to say about people who had put in the time to build the Democratic Party into what it is today. And some people, of course, right off the bat say, to hell with what the Democratic Party is today. It sucks. And It's easier for them to dismiss than it is for the people who said, I give up my Tuesday evenings to meet with the local Democratic Party all the time. Whenever there is an election coming up, if on election day I volunteer and I stand out there in the cold or the rain or what have you to hand out sample ballots. I knock on doors. I drive those infernal yard signs around and deliver them to people who believe they mean something, even in all face of all the evidence that it doesn't, or that they don't vote, or what have you. We've had this discussion 100 times as well. I actually like the yard signs. But whatever. The people who have built the party into what it is, even if you disagree with what it stands for, or even if you think it's poorly administered, what it is a ticket to the ballot in 50 states. And I guess ultimately on one level, it's all of the community involvement and all of the party building and all of the participation that people put into things and volunteer their time for. But on another level, like I said, what Bernie Sanders wants out of the Democratic Party, he doesn't really appear all that enamored of in any way, shape, or form, is a free shot at the ballot in all 50 states and all the territories. That's what running as the nominee of an established political party offers you, even if you are an independent. And there have been independent bids for the presidency, some of which are actually relatively successful in terms of getting on the ballot everywhere. But the rules are, at the moment, you might disagree with them, that not just any jackass can declare himself a presidential candidate and cause 50 states and all the territories to incur the expense of adding his or her name to the ballot and counting that person's votes. We sort of restrict the access to that. And some, on one level it's unfair, and on the other level you realize, that hundreds of thousands of people would simply declare themselves perhaps candidates for president if they really thought that they would just get an automatic spot on the ballot. You can always write them in. We don't stop that, but putting them on the ballot as a valid-looking choice is not something we offer to everybody. But it is, by the rules of most states and territories, something we offer to parties that regularly garner a significant portion of the vote. And we take that to mean that they ought to be taken seriously in the future. I don't know if that really holds as analysis, but that's what we do. So if you're an independent who's sort of kind of mostly closer to the Democratic Party than the Republican one, and you want to make a serious bid for president, you have to consider whether or not you want to submit yourself to the nominating process of this party that you're not really all that closely affiliated with. And so what essentially is happening here is somebody who holds themselves out as separate from the Democratic Party says, you have a thing that I want, that you have earned for yourself under the rules, unfair though they may be, through the consistent application of effort, the efforts of thousands, and I guess ultimately over time millions of people who do what they do because they call themselves Democrats, and they take the good with the bad and do the work. And what you're asking is for us to invite you in, to give you this mechanism to the that will allow you to access the ballot everywhere without doing the work of that would normally fall to an independent candidate of organizing in all these 50 states and in all the territories so that you can compete everywhere for every electoral vote possible, organizing the effort to raise the signatures that would be necessary, not only to gather them all, but to verify them all and to fight, as is often necessary, with the secretaries of state in all of these jurisdictions to prove that your petitions have been gathered validly and that they entitle you to ballot access. And only then, at that point, begin the expense and effort of fighting to tell American voters what it is you stand for and why you should be president and or why the others should not. So it's an enormous advantage that you're being handed here. And I guess the question then is ought there to be an enormous price for having that handed to you? Or could the price simply be as much as saying thanks to the people who actually built that system, corrupt though you may believe it to be, but which you will happily use to contend for the presidency? I don't know. And I don't know. There are as many prices or price points that would be put on something like that as there are people who have participated in the building of that party. But frankly, Pence begins with the question, what would bridge the gap? And what would you need? Because I'd be willing to do that. I'm offering. Well, different people obviously will need different things, and I'm not so much of a party builder that I can speak for others. I'm not a party builder at all. Quite frankly, I avoid it like the plague. For many of the reasons that Bernie Sanders supporters often avoid party building operations like the plague. So anyway, my only question for me about what do I expect out of a Bernie Sanders in exchange for the nomination? And I don't know whether there's anybody in a position to answer my questions about it, but I would be asking, like I did last time, my 2016 decision as to whether to vote for Bernie Sanders versus Hillary Clinton was largely based on, well, I know what goes into this party building, and I know what goes into it to some extent from the side of the president who would carry the Democratic banner. There's a lot of work that has to be done by the Democratic nominee, and especially a Democratic nominee who's successful and is elected to the presidency. A lot of work that has to be done in building and maintaining the party, the rubber chicken circuit, campaigning for other candidates, campaigning or actually even appearing at things that are even dumber than that, state party fundraisers. The worst, the insiders of the insiders at the level that nobody who follows national politics only cares about. But you got to show up to the, New York State Democratic Party, which is a problematic Democratic state party in many ways. And California has its difficulties as well, anywhere where it's sizable, and some of the smaller ones too. But you got to show up and help raise money for it. You got to show up and help raise money for candidates also running under that banner. That was something that Bernie Sanders had never really done prior to 2016, but he's improved his performance, at least with respect to supporting individual Democratic candidates in certain places. And, you understand why he would reserve his right not to be expected to campaign for any and all Democrats who will agree to carry the banner no matter what their positions are. We understand that. But my question was whether I could see Bernie Sanders doing that kind of party building and maintenance work cheerfully enough to make it effective versus seeing Hillary Clinton do that. And Hillary Clinton had a track record of doing so, and doing so rather effectively, whereas Bernie Sanders did not. But I didn't think that it was impossible for him to create such a record. But I guess coming to the question again in 2020, I ask, how much enthusiasm do I think he's going to have for building the party, even if we get to the point where he wins and he gets to make it be about rebuilding the party and refashioning the party in his image, which I assume he would be a little bit more enthusiastic about. And it's easy to think, if you win the presidency, it's something that's easier to be enthusiastic about if, because you've won, you've also won for yourself the prerogative to remake the party in your image. That's the sort of thing that I think people probably find some enthusiasm for, a little easier than, holding your nose and raising money for candidates and state parties who actually are, opposed to your very basic values. That'd be a difficult thing to do. People do it, but it's a lot easier if you're remaking the party in your image. That's got to be true. But I'd want to know a little bit more about, like, what does the future of the party look like under a President Bernie Sanders, and how much effort do I really believe he'd put into building it? My worry is that he's never been all that dependable in terms of party building, but we understand why, and we assume things would change if he were remaking the party in his image. But and I guess you could throw the age thing in there, but that would be a factor for just about anyone. Well, since they're also all the leading candidates, well, I guess with the exception of Buttigieg, if you consider him a leading candidate, are old. And okay, fine, so it all breaks even there. But I guess I'd want to know that there's a plan for building the party so that more candidates. I mean, I assume that the passage of his agenda requires the election of like-minded or and the persuasion of non-like-minded Democrats in Congress, right? So that there's a big at least pro-Bernie agenda contingent in Congress. And I wonder whether the combination of his disdain for fundraising from big money sources in particular, which helps bring you up to speed in party building a lot faster than small donations, but I understand the need for depending on small donations. Can you recreate the whole thing and hit the same donors or even an expanded donor base to build a party such that there's resources available for all the rest of the people who need to win election or re-election in order to support the passage of your agenda? Or are you leaving them on your own? Or are you smashing the party apparatus because you don't think there should be such a thing as a party in general? That I worry about a little bit too. And I'm not sure whether that ends up looking like pulling up the ladder behind you and leaving the troops that you need to support your agenda to fend for themselves. If you were going to make use of this thing that other people built and then smash it behind you because you don't believe in big money operations in politics, and I don't know that that's what he plans to do, but I don't know what replaces things. I mean, you may have a great plan for it. I just haven't seen it yet. And, admittedly now might not necessarily be the time to unveil such a plan when you're too busy unveiling plans to do the rest of the things you wanted to do once you're elected president. I just found that an interesting question. I wonder whether we'll see anything about that addressed at any point. The other side of the coin, another interesting Twitter thread that I saw shared by Dave Camper, who tweets with a rose next to his name and everything, pointing out an interesting tweet thread from Chris Brooks, who tweets as CH, like ch, activist, chactivist, I guess if you read it all at once, CH activist, chactivist, not sure. Chris Brooks, staff writer and organizer for Labor Notes, with bylines occasionally in publications you would know like The Intercept and The Nation and In These Times and Jacobin magazine as well. He tweets here, New York Times reporting that the Dem Party establishment is conniving to deny Sanders the nomination at a brokered convention. We're hearing more and more about that idea. Hilariously, he says they're trying to justify the coup by feigning concern for down-ballot races they believe will lose if Sanders is the nominee. And, of course, lots of people commenting on that possibility. Yes, true. Dave Camper, continuing on here, by the way, saying that none of the people in the story from the New York Times is quoted as saying that they want to launch a coup. They're saying that if no one has a majority of delegates, delegates will have the right to choose. So we're back to the superdelegates question as well. But more to the point, the question of what do we do if everybody stays in the race and nobody comes in with a majority of pledged delegates to their credit. I found it very interesting. Dave continues on saying, look, they have the right to the opinion that maybe the better nominee would be someone other than Sanders. And it's being very generous about this and saying, I suspect that their fear for down-ballot races is not feigned. I think they're wrong, but that's different than saying that the beliefs are not genuine. you've got a group within the Democratic Party who, in the teeth of unlimited evidence, still believe that some kind of milquetoast centrism is the way to win. I don't agree with that, but the default position of many on the left is that such opinions are blind for something else, and I think we should take them at their word. But he goes on to say something very interesting in pointing out that it's his opinion, he says, that sometimes the people on the left have never really undertaken a large-scale study and understanding of the rules and procedures by which nominations are meted out. And that's always troublesome for me. I think that people ought to be doing that, and he thought that's been missing from the left, whereas the Goldwater takeover of the right was characterized by that sort of study and leveraging of the rules. I simply reminded him that it has happened on the left before. It just didn't happen last time. Remember this, and this will be my last thought for things before we cut out. I'll give it to you after this message.
From Daily Kos Radio on networksradio.com. You have been listening to the Kagro in the Morning Show
with David Waldman.
And it was just this. It has happened on the left before. It happened after the 2004 elections. A lot of Howard Dean supporters did exactly that and put themselves in leadership positions from the hard work and application of the lessons that they learned that way. What happened to them? Well, they became the establishment and have since been dismissed.